Mai tātou, nā mihi nui nā ko kia koutou katoa. E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā mate, e nā wako te motu. Nā kaumātua, nā kuia, tēnā koutou, tēnā katoa. He taku mihi, I naine e roto e te reo Pākehā. I'm scared. I'm shit scared, really, if I can be honest. Okay. Let me explain why. You can talk all over the world to people, but when you talk to family, it's a different thing. And we are all teachers. We use that word not to describe a profession, but to describe a calling. It's a thing that means that even if there wasn't a state system here, in some way, in families and communities, we would probably be taking this role. And so we feel education, I would suggest, not as policy, but as a pulse of life. So we know when it's not well, we know when its spirit's not well, and we know those things in it that are alive, that give life. So I just clarify a couple of things. Whatever I'm going to say, you can walk out and go, that was bollocks, all right? So, because I'm not God. I'm not God. I make mistakes, and I think probably like any of us, we make our way forward in this complex, messy thing called learning by making mistakes. But then we recover, and we move forward into into a place that other people couldn't go. The second one is that, oftentimes when I go to conferences and you get these people standing up and they give these beautiful edited versions of their life, and I go back to my classroom and I think, oh God, I'm a schmuck. So I come away from conferences feeling worse than when I went, because everybody seems to be so adored and they don't have wet lunch hours, or kids who show up with tattoos that they carved into their fingers that morning and you're having to rush them up to your mate who's a doctor. So I decided to take a slightly different approach with this. I'm going to show you the vulnerability of it, because we all know that we have this, and this is the bit that gets erased. So when I talk about disobedient teaching, this is what I'm talking about. I don't mean disobedience about being a pillock. I think disobedience is another word for professionalism in this job. I think it's when we productively disobey something. So it's got nothing to do with naughtiness. It has to do with guts. It has to do with looking into the heart of something and going, even though this is fashionable, even though this is funded, even though this is adored, my professional radar tells me this is not right, and I will not lie down. I will not buckle down. I will find ways to disobey productively so that the kids with whom I work, the communities to whom I belong, and the school to whom I owe affiliation, but also my professional criticality, get something that's worthy of who I am. We came into this profession with a dream. At the point when that dream starts dying, we have to look very seriously at things, including our own propensity to disobey. So when I wrote that book, Disobedient Teaching, it was not about how to be a shit, 50 ways how to be a shit. It was a kind of a call to go, maybe we must remind ourselves what being professional really is, because we are highly educated and we are at the chalk face. And unlike any other profession in this country, this is extraordinary, in this room, we see the full cross-section of this nation. Okay, so not like medicine, not like teaching. We see everybody. We see its full range of neurodiversity. We see its full socio pattern, its full cultural patterns, its full anxieties, its hopes, its fear. They all pass through. They all flow through us. So we are in a unique position of unique insight. But largely, we have been encouraged to become passive. Oftentimes, teaching, I would argue, is one of the most untrusted and marginalised body of highly educated, expert people. We end up being micromanaged. It's not good enough. It's not good enough. We're worth more, and we matter more. So when I wrote this, and I'm going to spend just like a few seconds on it. When I wrote this, it was only because I was upset by, I've been teaching for 40 years, so I started when I was 19, and now I'm 62. And that probably doesn't add up because my maths was always bollocks. But yeah, I can see people going like this with their fingers. But the thing that's always distressed me is the exodus from this profession. You know, we know that within 5 years of starting, a third of our population, a third of teachers have left. But we also know there's another exodus, and this is the one that really hurts. People with hopes and dreams and great talent whose spirit dies in the profession, and they tread water bitterly, and there's a taste of bile in their mouth where there was once hope, and it's invisible, except for the people who learn with them. That worries me. That worries me because I'm very proud to be a teacher, and I see this amazing resource getting injured. So I wrote the book only to try and put an arm around the shoulders of people going, look, we need you. We need you. And in my stumbling ways, look, you might go, I shouldn't even listen to this guy. I got expelled from secondary school. I was thrown out of teachers' college. I wasn't certificated at the end of my first year. I've been before boards of trustees and growled at. So you might go, this seriously, the only obedient thing I'm going to do today is shut this guy down. But by the same token, and twice I hit the wall, I burned out. But I came back, just like you come back, because we don't have a choice about that. And so I wrote the book to try and be an arm around your shoulders, because that's what we sometimes suffer, which is professional loneliness. And especially those of you who are truly innovators, that is a real issue that we face. We feel alone, unprofessional, disobedient, wrong, when it's very likely that we're not. So I wanted to start with something quite personal, but I'm going to turn it back to you for a moment. We hear a lot about what drives great education systems. We publish in our magazines list of NCEA results or world rankings according to PISA or whatever, and we get this construct of what makes great teaching. But I want you to just think, I'm not going to ask you to stand up and mime, okay, so you're going to be able to do this and no one's going to ask any questions about it. Okay, I want you to think for a moment about a teacher that you had somewhere in your past who mattered to you, who did something in terms of your learning that was good for you. And I want you to close your eyes. I want you to look at that person in your mind's eye and very quietly just say their name to yourself. Okay. Now look at them where they're standing. Now if you could say something to them about why they mattered, no one's going to hear you say this. In your mind's eye, or with your mind's mouth, tell them why they mattered. Just tell them why they mattered. Now open your eyes a moment. Just, could you just put up your hand if the reason that they mattered to you was that they strategically were able to design learning activities to help you meet prescribed outcomes? Okay, so we have quite a absence of hands. Okay, could you put up your hands if the reason that they mattered, if the reason they were such a great teacher was because they were able to employ a wide range of technologies to disseminate knowledge? Shit, okay, so could you put up your hand if the reason that they mattered was because somehow they touched the human condition in you? They let you know that you were valuable, that you counted for something. Could you put up your hands? Stand up, please. Stand up. That's why you matter. Look around that room. This is what we miss too often. That's why you matter. And this is why you cannot afford to mistrust the human nature of teaching. Please sit down a moment. A few days ago, I was invited back to Te Awamutu, which was where I got expelled from. And my last time seriously, I mean, people selectively forget stuff, you know. And the local courier said, oh, he's coming to speak about teaching. And, you know, literally the last time I left that school, I was escorted out. And oh, shit. Anyway, and I got there, and I was really, before I speak, probably like some of you, people think because we're teachers, we're masses of confidence. You know, we wear long pants because the knees are knocking. You know, it's nervous stuff. And I went for a little walk around the school, and because there was a lot of quite difficult stuff there. Walked through the quads where I opened my lunchbox and there was human excrement in it. I got hauled out of the closet when I was 15. Okay. I walked past Miss Mallett's classroom where they used to sing God Save the Queen before I walked in and laugh hysterically while they jostled you at the door. All those things in those schools where the geography for some kids of a school is not a safe place. It's not the same for everybody. For kids that school's not safe for, the geography means the safe countries are places like the library. Some of you know this, right? So, and anyway, as I was walking back to the hall thinking, okay, shit, now I've got to stand up on the stage, I passed Miss Joel's room. Now, Miss Joel was the senior mistress of, oh, that sounds bad, but it's actually in a way quite close. She was the senior mistress of Te Awamutu College, and she could lower the temperature in a room by 10 degrees by just walking in there. You know, when she stood up on the stage and reached for her throat, you know, everybody paled. All the girls were pulling the hems of their dresses down a little further because she knew she was looking to see how far above the kneecaps the dress was. So Miss Joel, everybody was terrified of Miss Joel, including me. And unfortunately, because I was a dumb kid, I got put into the lowest of the vocational classes because we divided, we had Hope, which were the A classes, and we had vocational. And at the bottom of the vocational was the what was called the spazzers room. And that was where I was and some of the other kids. And the reason that happened was because we measured the ability to learn and we measured intellect by the gods of literacy and numeracy, and that was it. They were the gods. So for those of us, many of you were these people, and many of you have taught these people who have extraordinary intellects but don't dance with those two great gatekeepers, they get relegated to this room. So when I got to Form 5, I was put into 5RB. Now, Te Awamutu did not practice the euphemism, so R stood for returns. Okay, so that meant those people who were going to take 2 years to do School C. You knew when you went into the class. And because we were the naughty ones, we got Miss Joel for English. And getting Miss Joel for English was kind of like a death knell. And this was back in the day of when we had things called School C. So in School C, you did a novel, you did a short story, you did some poems, you did a play. If you were dumb enough, you didn't have to put up with Shakespeare, but you got something that, and you probably got Animal Farm in there somewhere. Okay, yeah, you remember what this was, right? Okay, so I'm sitting there in Miss Joel's class, and me and Lewis Anderson, who don't know how to read, and we have sustained silent reading, you know, and that's the bit where. So if any of you have had that time of being very late developing the skill of reading, what you're doing is you're trying to make labyrinths in the white spaces between the words, or you counting up the numbers of shapes on the page. So because you've got to sit there for 20 minutes. And then partway through the lesson, she decided to read us some poetry. And the reason I'm telling you this is because just underneath this book, there's another book. And I don't write about this, but I think it's something that you'll understand. She started reading to us from this book. It was the poetry of Wilfred Owen. Now, for farm kids, Wilfred Owen wasn't going to go across terribly well, but while she was reading, an extraordinary thing happened. She was halfway through reading out about froth-corrupted lungs and mustard gas, and she started crying. And the whole room went like this, because, God, this was Miss Joel, and she was crying. And I saw a teacher for the first time. I saw when someone makes a commitment that close and lets their human side out. And Well, the legend that went round, of course, that Miss Joel was Miss Joel because her lover had obviously gone away to the First World War and been killed, and that she had waited on the platform of Te Awamutu railway station with a blue poetry book and a bunch of violets, and he had never come off the train. And so as the exodus of lovers stream off the train, there's Miss Joel left with in the smoke disappearing with this, condemned to recite poetry for the rest of her life. Well, the reason she lived with Mrs. Martin Smith had nothing to do with it. That was what we were convinced was the reason that Miss Joel was Miss Joel, because this terrible thing had happened. It was a glorious story. Anyway, so she said to us, so she recovered herself, finished the poem, and then she said, right, well, that's the poem you've got to learn for School C. So you've got to learn it so you can recite it. So tomorrow you're to come in and you're to go home, you learn it tonight and you write it out. And anyone who doesn't have it learned will have a detention. And you go, oh, fuck, here goes. Because I couldn't even read the bloody thing. And one of the things, though, if you can't read, you actually develop an extraordinary memory, because you have to have that exercising when other people don't. People can stop and make a list for their shopping. You can't if you can't read. So you become a frightening person in games of memory. One of the rare cases you become frightening anyway. So she was walking up and down the line, and she came to me, and I just thought, oh, shit, because it was going to be a detention anyway. And she did an extraordinary thing. She took the pen out of my fingers, and I thought, oh, shit, smacky, And she wrote 5 letters on my book, 5 letters in a row. And she said, do you know what that is? Of course I didn't. And I said, oh, no. And she said, Welby, it's a Greek word, and it says ethos. Do you know what ethos is? Well, thank God I didn't say he was a guy who made up fables. I was kind of clever. Because if you're dumb, you learn not to have too many guesses. And she said, it actually means the spirit of something. So tomorrow, I want you to bring me the spirit of that poem. So 2 things hit at once. The first one was that she doesn't think I'm stupid. She doesn't think I'm stupid. And the second was, this is much harder homework than everybody else has got. So I went home, and seriously, I dropped the word ethos at least 5 times that night, showing off that I had this cool word. But my grandfather, who was my step-grandfather, was staying with me. And after the euphoria of it died down, I thought, oh, shit, I've got to bring something to school tomorrow. And I said to him, in a naive way, do you have a World War II helmet or something? And a World War I helmet? And he said, no, and why? And I explained to him. And he did a really interesting thing, and most of us can remember it somewhere in our childhood, when an adult spoke to us as an equal. And he said to me, that poem was written by a man who was put in a psychiatric institution. And they let him out, he went back to the war, and he was killed in the last days of the war. And he was protesting against the war. That wasn't a war poem the way you're describing it. That was a poem where his heart was torn open like a chippy packet. And he was trying to tell people about it. And he said, when we were in the trenches, there's things people don't tell you. They don't tell you what the smell of a human body is after it bloats with air. They don't tell you what the wet does to a body when you cannot go and get it. And that's your cobber. That's the person you signed up with and you agreed to protect. And he's out there. And he said, and you're so tired that you don't know the difference between being awake and being asleep. He said, those stories never make the Anzac Poppy stories. They never make it. And he said, your heart breaks. And then he said an extraordinary thing. He went over to the piano and he said, one of the things we used to do sometimes it would just be humming. There was an old hymn we used to hum when you were between sleeping and waking and the pain was so big, you had to have something to calm you down. He told me about this, and the next day I went to school, and I was all fired up. I thought, shit, I'm not going to get a detention. This is going to be a crowning glory, and it never works out like that. But anyway, went into class, and bugger me days, she didn't ask everybody to write out the thing. We went into a comprehension exercise, and the class ticks over, and I'm watching the hand as it limps up towards the hour. And then she said to everybody, all right, I think she was just playing with them. She said, all right, I want you to now, everybody, write down the full poem, Dulce Decorum Me. So if you know it, it's got several verses. Nobody had learned it. Nobody had learned it. First couple of lines, if you're lucky. And I watched her again, and I saw her heart kind of wilt heavily. And I felt sorry for her, because the day before she had given something very tender about herself. And anyway, she walked around, and I thought you were going to see people disemboweled all over the class, but she didn't do anything. And she came up and she said, the bell went, she said, you can go. And everyone sort of looking around going, no detention. Oh, jelly meat hasn't got us, we're cool. So we walk out the door, and I walk out the door too, because I'm trying to be cool. And I walk down the steps with everybody. And then I turned around. You know, in adolescence, sometimes we make those mistakes where oh shit, here we go. So I walked back up to the classroom, and she was in the room, and she was rubbing the blackboard. And I couldn't walk in to the room, so I just stood at the door and I'm nervous doing this because after last night's Wyatt, so this is going to be. So I sang what my grandfather had taught me, and it went like this. Abide with me, soft falls the eventide, when darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide, when other helpers fail and comfort flees, help to the helpless, Lord, abide with me. And I didn't look up. And all I could think of was this was a fucking stupid thing to do, because here I was standing on the doorstep in Miss Jell's room with her. And the trouble was she didn't move. She didn't do anything. And when I looked up, she was standing at a desk, and she picked up this book, the collected poems of Wilfred Owen. And she walked across and gave it to me. So some of us learn to read from school journals. Some of you, because of your particular kind of intellect, were reading before you came to school. Some of you learned from the Hungry Lambs and Boat Day and sliding and flying and stars in the air. You remember them. I learned to read the poems of Wilfred Owen because somebody wrote the word ethos in my book. And I knew that she believed in me. And I went years later to try and find her. I made that terrible mistake of not telling her how much she mattered once I came to understand what learning and teaching was. And she was in an old people's home. And she sat and looked out the window, and she didn't know who I was, and it didn't make any sense to her, and I was too late. But we're not too late for everybody who comes in through our classroom, you know. And a lot of us, the reason that we are such powerful, empathetic teachers is because there's been a bit of fire in our own background. We have the ability to reach into the human condition. That is what sustains us when other people give up. And so I think that disobedient teaching is the ultimate humanity in us that is driven by that humanity and then reaches beyond the known. So the reason I was at that school was because at Bukiato Primary, I was in the rhinoceroses group. Sorry, I've tinkered with the photograph there to show it. But when you're in the rhinoceroses group, when you're in the equivalent of that, You learn, you either have to be good and nice so that people will value you. So you get valued for cleaning out the art jars, or get valued for taking out the rubbish. And you'll get the comment on tries hard year after year after year. Or you learn to be naughty to protect yourself. So you don't get shamed when you have Bert's word recognition test and you're working through them and you know the only word you know after ocean is right down at the bottom and it's Tysus, and somebody told you and you learned it by heart. And you're standing up there in front of the class again and again being shamed. So to protect yourself from shame, you become tough and you go, I don't care. I don't know. I'm thick. I'm thick. Thick is a defense you use to protect a fragile heart. The trouble is we come to learn that so deeply that some people don't recover from it. They don't recover and find the extraordinary intellect they have. And that's been my driving passion as a teacher. What is the nature of those other intellects that do such extraordinary things? So the problem that I've identified, and you can disagree with this, is that we, as teachers, we actually have very deep understandings of our kids, but we're asked to replace those with a very blunt tool. It's a symbolic substitute that we call a mark. So it's a letter or a grade, and it replaces deeper description. And what happens, it's only symbolic, it's not real, but what happens, it becomes real because we reward it. So people start learning to work for marks. They lose touch with the spirit and the value of what is being learned and bow down to the God of its symbolic substitute. I've come to the position in my teaching now that marks are actually wrong, that they're not a good move, and that they don't help with education. And that's because marks they don't measure learning, they measure the performance of learning. They're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. The ability to perform learning is a certain skill. Oftentimes, we have situations where we go, they did really, really badly in the test. Our heart's breaking because we know they know. We know because we've been embodied in that learning process. Through all its nuances, we know that they know. But this blunt, rude tool that we've allowed to become elevated to a station way beyond its capabilities says that they don't. And so I started asking, well, what is this marking? Maybe marking was always there. Do you know it wasn't? It wasn't. It's actually quite a relatively new thing. If you go back to the Middle Ages, there were no marks. If you go into the Renaissance, there were no marks. There were no marks because what people did is what they still do at a PhD level. It's the only place we've still got it. There's no mark for a PhD. You develop a body of knowledge, it goes to some scholars, they read it, and they sit down with you, and they talk with you about it, and then they go, yep, you seem to have a deep understanding, we've grilled you on it. So they are using reflection and digging into the work. So what we have is if you go back to where it first appeared, so when we dig historically, we can find this. So in the late 1700s in Yale University was the first time that any division came in. So that translates as A, B, C minus, and crap. Okay, so those were the first divisions where there was no longer a description of the complexity of their learning. There was simply a word put as a substitute, as a symbolic substitute. Now that unfortunately got picked up by other universities and then used as a dumbed-down replacement. In New Zealand education, it's a really interesting thing. So in the New Zealand context, if we go back to the 1800s, we came across a thing in 1889 which was called the Day of Judgment. Now this was right through all the schools and the communities that you live in, and it happened around about what used to be the last year of primary school. Before intermediates. Okay, and so what happened was they didn't trust you as a teacher. The inspectors would come in and they would test your kids. You were not in the room, you were taken out, you couldn't be trusted. Okay, so they tested them and then they took those marks away, and depending on those, kids got the right to go to secondary school or didn't. So it was called the Day of Judgment because communities were held up and displayed because they had the curious habit, you would think we would never ever do this again, of publishing the results in the local newspaper. By 1902, we realised how damaging this was and we stopped it. Never to be seen again. So we realised that this was doing damage because parents, and so what happened was that schools were training their kids. They put educating aside and they trained their kids for the test. So they tried to work out what would be in the test. They did training exercises. Parents helped by getting their kids in their best clothes. The teachers put flowers around the room, took down the manky old things and put up new things in the room, anything to try and sway it, because there was a gatekeeper here. So they were trying to look after their kids. So what happens after that is in 1944, we bring in a thing called matriculation. And then growing out of that is university entrance and school certificate. Now these then became, and these were generally, the dumbed down way of assessing the complexity of your learning was to put you in a hall for 3 hours with a clock ticking and to give you 50 questions and go, depending on how well she or he does, that tells us how bright they are. You know, we still use a 2-hour test for the PISA results. And you go, what on earth is that actually measuring? So, this is why I have begun to question testing. Why not? Well, William Myers said a really interesting thing about the kind of testing that is where you are isolating a person, like in a row or whatever, and asking them to perform learning. And he said, this is what these comparative tests that have taken hold in diverse countries over the world, but so triumphing in places like Sweden and in the United States, where it's become hugely dominant system. This is what he said they don't measure. So they can't measure initiative, creativity, imagination, conceptual thinking, curiosity, effort, irony, judgment, commitment, nuance, goodwill, ethical reflection, or a host of other valuable attributes. Can't do that. What it can do, well, it can measure and count isolated skills, specific facts and functions, content knowledge, but these are the least interesting elements of learning. They're certainly not the ones that work for people who gain agency after they leave school. But we make the assessment of that person's ability on such a limited thing. So, one of the difficulties that this makes is that we get people leaving school with an illusion of success. Now, these are people who've been shaped by the system. They've learned to read the formula. They're the ones that we get into universities, which is often, generally they think of themselves as they're ones who tell you their grade point average, right? So see themselves as very high achievers. And they have this idea that they're really bright, when in fact often what it is they're articulate and they know how to read formula, but they're not necessarily bright. And you get some people who can't even get into the university, who just scrape in, who are not like that. They may not be articulate, and they may not be, they may not have great grade point average, but they have the most extraordinary intellects. The most extraordinary intellects. It's just that in many cases, their intellect has become invisible to them. It's been replaced by this other thing over the top. So one of the things it does is it gives people a false idea about them being bright. So you've probably got sitting inside you the idea of I'm no good at maths, or I'm no good at geography, or it was probably shaped by a mark. It was probably shaped by a mark, not by the nuanced and complex nature of your thinking. So, one of the other problems that in New Zealand I think we still have a far too high emphasis on comparative assessment. The assessment thing has got way out of control. As a teacher, the tool I really want, if there's any testing, is diagnostic. I want to know how that person thinks. I want to know that so that I can design better learning environments for them. It's not helpful to me knowing how they map up against some national standard, which in some strange way makes some assumptions about average behaviour and then maps people against it. And it's certainly no help knowing how that person maps against somebody else. Professionally, that's no use to me. You're providing me with tools that are useless. And yet those tools that you provide me are the ones that you value and support and hammer in time and time to a level of fatigue, exhaustion, frustration, but they don't help me move the learning forward. All they do is help me try and train people to map their performances up against indicators. That's not what I came into this profession for, and I don't think it's what anybody in this room came into this profession for. So the other one is this, is it teaches dependency. You know, when we measure, when we bring people enough on now from the time they're 5, okay, we're doing this, we bring them into the idea that somebody other than them will make the assessment on their learning, and that will be the true thing. So we're now starting alarmingly early with this. And what happens is that people come to the teacher to ask how they're learning. Now, after 10 years in an education system, you would expect, if it was healthy, for somebody to be able to tell you how they learn. Let me show you something. I'm going to ask you something about yourself. I'm going to ask you 5 questions. Now, don't worry, there's no, you can't be wrong with this. It's just interesting to look at. It's about you. Okay, here's the first one. Do you know what causes you to retain certain information and not others? Let's try a second one. Do you know how you increase your chances of discovery when you're doing something? Do you know your most effective strategies for learning from failure? When something goes wrong, how do you learn from it? The last one. What are the strategies you've got for pushing yourself beyond competence? So you're bright, you do really well. What are your strategies for pushing yourself beyond there? Now, in a good education system, a person should be able to answer those things because they're all about you. They are all about you. You have the most intimate knowledge of how your extraordinary brain works when it learns. Yet most of us would have had trouble answering those questions about us. And we've lived inside this system, this body, for years and years and years, and we are educators. And if you are able to answer those questions, I might ask, did you learn that in school? Or did you learn that out of school, outside of the formal education system? Imagine an education system where somebody at 6 years old could tell you those things. Go, when something doesn't work, how do you get better? What happens when it doesn't work? But those are questions that get asked in an education system that is truly predicated on learning, where the child is actually in the centre, not a national standard, not an imagined matrix of performances. And the problem we face is this thing called Campbell's law. Campbell was in the 1970s was an American philosopher and methodologist, and he basically, Campbell's law says this, basically, I'm going to translate it. He says, if you take a public service like medicine or education, and you tie rewards like payment to performance in it, you'll get corruption. Okay, because people are going to try and work it to the best for their kids or for themselves. So this is when Diane Ravitch wrote the devastating book in 2010, where she'd been the darling of the Bush and Clinton administration. She had wheeled in charter schools, she had wheeled in performance pay, she'd pushed this really hard, and she had a meltdown road to Damascus moment when she started looking at the corruption principals and teachers had gone through to make sure that their school marks seemed to go up. And she documented it assiduously. She's a beautiful academic, beautiful writer. Frightening stuff. And yet we get stuck in a moral dilemma because we go, okay, ethically I don't want to do this, but what about my kids? Are they not going to get choices here? And so we get pulled into behaviour that we would not stand for in ourselves normally. We perform in something under what we're capable of. And so let me give you an example. I worked with a guy a few years ago. This guy, he's not a bad person. He was considered a great teacher. And it was in a secondary school, though. And he was the head of English. And what he did was, because he was head of English, he also was head of timetabling and allocation in classes, so you probably know where this is going. So what happened was his classes were populated by these really, really, really high-performing students. And the rest of us all got 1 or 2 tokens, so that if we moaned, he'd say, "But you've got Sandra Williams." You go, "Yeah, 1. Yeah. But he was adored. He was adored by the school. He was adored by the parents, because everybody in his class passed. They all passed. But every year he did this little token thing. He'd put a couple of people in there who were, to use his term in the staff room, dummies. Okay. And that was to show that really he was being magnificent. But he had a couple of strategies with it. Here's number 1. He'd say to them, I'm really worried about your learning, and I just feel this course is too hard for you, and the stress of sitting the examination. So we've got this other alternative program where you don't have to sit an exam. Translated, you don't bring down my grade point average. Okay. We'd like you to go across there. So this is gushing with saccharine care. Okay. So why don't you take that course? So if the kid's smart, they go, no, I want to go at the exam. So stage 2 goes, mid-year exams. You realise if you don't pass, you don't qualify to sit the exam at the end of the year. So lots of kids did those exams and then thought, oh, well, I can't go and sit the exam. Unfortunately, in some cases, there were parents who go, no, legally he's not allowed to do that. So you can still sit the exam. Bugger. So there's only one strategy left, and that is just to incrementally wear the person down with subtle derision, with raising the eyebrows. And in general, most kids leave. And he preserved this magnificent thing, magnificent performance. He did in-service days. He was the kind of guy standing up at these things, sharing great policy. He could edit the stories of his teaching brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. He was the guy you went away going, oh shit, he's so good, why am I teaching? But 10 years later, came back to that school for a reunion. And the kids, he wasn't a god anymore. The kids who had been taught by him, he wasn't a god anymore. That name, Shithole, had another word that sounds very much like it, which is what they referred to him with. And then you go, well, who counted? Who counted as teachers? Do you know who it was? The same people you put your hand up at the beginning about. They were people who cared when things were a bit tough. They were people who explained how the system works so you'd find a better way of negotiating it when you were crashing. They were people who cared. And I would argue they were teachers. So very briefly, I'd like to talk about some thinkers that I think pay the price, some kinds of thinkers, and this will be some of you. So some of these are people I work with who either scrambled into university because they came as adults, they couldn't get in, or they were people who recovered education to get in, or they were people who came through certificate courses and managed. So I have this great belief as anything that gives people channels in to further education is an important thing. So and these are real people. So let me just show you. First one is this. This is the reflective thinker. This may be you. If it's not you, you'll know someone like this. This is the person who is not good being put in a room with a clock ticking and go perform 50 questions in 2 hours. They're the kind of person who says, look, can you give me a night to think on this? The sort of person that when the problem comes up, they dwell with it because what's happening is intellectually they are examining it from a multiple variation of perspectives. They're turning it around and looking at it quietly, internally, in ways that they cannot document or account for. They are deeply reflective. They need time. So that kind of person does extremely badly in anything when you're asking for a performance that's like this. Read this aloud, work through this list, answer this. They do very badly. They're often brilliant intellect, but they profile badly. Paul? Well, this is what Paul just designed a few years ago. It's a wheelchair that climbs upstairs. This is a dumb kid. Dalita. Dalita just graduated as the first Tongan woman doctor in graphic design 3 years ago. She was a magnificent woman to work with. She couldn't get into university. She managed to get in by doing a special certificate course. Her grades all the way through were kind of C minus with the odd A in it. And invariably the A was something where there wasn't a comparative test. But she's what I would call a finely tuned thinker. This is the kind of person who solves problems in their context. So when you take them out of the context and ask them to solve it abstractly, they don't do it well. They're the kind of person who panics when they're fed questions very quickly or they're asked to perform very suddenly. So they're capable of really great thinking, but they're finely tuned. So they get panic attacks, if you like. So the sort of person where you go 7 times 8 minus 3 plus 2, and they go, oh shit. Yeah. They can do that. Of course they can do it. But not when you put the demand on like that. So she designed a new form of documentary based on a particular speech form called Veitalatala. She said, when I see my aunties interviewed on TV, they put a mic in front of their face and they ask them questions, and you never hear the beauty inside them. You see nervousness and awkwardness and backing away. But she said, when we're at home and everyone's sitting around the table, these ladies are so articulate, and there's such rhythm, and there's such nuance and humour. There's all this beauty. There has to be a new way of designing documentary making that will capture that beauty. And that she developed from an analysis of that particular speech form an editing system, but also a new way of approaching an interview where the understanding was the future and the past and the present are all sustained in the same moment. And you go, what kind of brain is that? What's the kind of brain that we give a C minus to? Thank God she's teaching. Carol, this is the material thinker. This is the person who thinks well if you give them stuff to work with. So one of the difficulties that we ran into in the 1960s and 70s was this idea that if you do think that the ability to think in concrete form gets replaced by a higher order that is abstract. So concrete operational, we get rid of that and now we work in abstract. It's bollocks. So the new thinking around material thinking takes into account of how is it that you get people in very, very advanced levels who actually think inside a relationship with a material. So Carol, who when you will still say to her as an adult, what's 4 plus 3? And you'll see her fingers going 5, 6, 7. She's still physically, it's not this low order, it's just a natural way of thinking, part of that neurodiversity. So she is able to think like this and like this. Exquisite thought. But she thinks inside a relationship with the material. She is in a discourse, a dialogue with her hands and so Polysema, the Finnish philosopher, theorist, talks about is the thinking hand. Some of you have them. Some of you have them. Oftentimes, these people don't calculate, they estimate exquisitely. So they feel their way through potential. And here's the one that does not come on the radar. So I taught, it's not her real name, but I taught Alice a few years ago. I'd just come back from Holland, and so I was a bit late. And she came into my office and she said, I'm first year postgrad. And she said, I want you to be my supervisor. And I said, why? And she said, well, the others don't get it. And I said, what makes you think I'm going to get it? And she said, well, look, first of all, let me be clear. I have the highest grade point average entering the course. And I don't need much from you. I just need you to show me what has done well because I want an A+. And I said, okay, I'm not the guy you want to supervise you. Okay, I can tell you very honestly, I'm the worst guy to supervise you. And she said, yeah, but you're the professor, so it'll look good on my CV. Shit. Anyway, so I said to her, well, look, if we're going to work together, I've got some beliefs. I believe that you're in research as a culture. So you're going to be there supporting other people, and you're going to be listening to them talk about your research. And she said, I don't need it. I just need to know the example. I need to know what the learning outcomes are and what I have to do to get an A+. I can do it. From the time I was a kid, everything that I did was cool, was put on the fridge with a magnet. I got all the way through school by finding out the agenda, finding out what was required, and I did it. And that's why I'm so good. So just give me the stuff and I'll get the A+. And so I tried again saying I'm not the kind of guy that you want, but she insisted, so I insisted that she turned up to tutorial. The first one she came into, she sat there with her arms folded, and at the end of it, she stood up and she said to the other people in the group, I just want you to know you've wasted 2 hours of my time. And she walked down. She was wounded. She was really damaged, and she didn't know. She didn't know, because what was frightening her was that she had learned to be risk averse. She had been massaged into always being successful. She had been poisoned by success. So she had no skills at failing and recovering. She didn't know how to do it. So she disparaged anything that would come that would destabilize her. So as a result, she couldn't really think in adventurous or dangerous or disobedient ways. She couldn't. But to keep that at bay, she just became contemptuous. Now, at the end of the time, she put in the thesis, and it didn't get her A+. She got 2 exquisite reports, 3-page reports. You know what she did? She flipped to the end, looked at the grade, her blood level dropped, she threw them on the sofa and she said they didn't get it. She didn't read the reports. And I said, hey, these are 2 scholars in your field. And she said they didn't get it. Now, she took a complaint. She complained about the examiner, she complained about the course, she complained about the literature, she complained about the quality of students that were working on this, she complained about her supervision. What she didn't understand is that she wasn't ready, and might not for a long time be ready to actually learn. What she was ready to do was perform. So here's the problem with it. Tamara Erickson's a very interesting theorist who's talked about the kids that you're working with at the moment. And for those of you who are working with very young kids, actually their parents. So those people, unlike many of you, have no conscious memory of learning to use a computer. From the time that they were growing up, it was just there. So they understand technology because they've grown up, if you like, with the invisible blueprint on it. They understand the logic of how it works. For schmucks like us, we can still sit there being confused with the remote, right? With the TV remote. Okay. But these kids don't. These are the kids who you go and ask for advice, and they go, blah, 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 and you go, oh, shit. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And then you have to go and ask somebody else. Now, she noticed some interesting things about these people. So we're trying to attract the very best of these people into our organisations, the high innovators, but we're not keeping them. So statistically, we see we're not keeping them. So she started asking the questions why. So what we know about these people, so these are coming through the doors as new teachers, and they're coming up through our schools. Okay, so they have a high technological understanding. They have a very high exposure to ideas. In other words, they can go on YouTube and find whatever they want. So we were brought up with somebody acting as an editor or a publisher or distributor, sitting over there selecting what was quality ideas and what wasn't. The difficulty is they don't have the skills to discern between what is a quality idea and what is a rubbish idea, because ideas are valued in that world by how much they're liked. So we've got quite a crisis sitting on our hands with this. They're used to getting things when they need it. So if they go into a damaged hierarchy where someone goes, well, you'll get this when I think you're ready for it, they go, okay, and they go home and they get it. So they're not used to organisations that manage power by withholding information, because that's not how they grew up. They grew up in an environment where you shared knowledge, where you could get knowledge, you could post knowledge back on board. So it's a very different model to the one that we operate in. And so they also used to multiple truths and opportunities. So when you have a war has just happened somewhere, they don't wait to see what TV3 does with it. They go online and they find various versions of it, because that's sitting there. So here you've got a seismic shift in a kind of person. And we are educating that, and we're also employing that now. But then at the same time, we're seeing people leaving. If you've got a company, an organisation, a school, That does not grow innovation. Those people leave very quickly and they set up their startup models. They're going away setting up little businesses, they said, because they're very empowered. Here they are. They live in global economies and digitized worlds. Knowledge is plural to them. It's not a single absolute. They're used to innovation as a living part of themselves. They're happy with complexity. They're happy with change. They work collaboratively. So the idea of the singular hero is nowhere near as embedded as it is for us. And they're used to a shared commitment and responsibility. So one thing that I think New Zealand education does extremely well, that we don't talk about very often, and I see this now when I'm working in other countries, we're extremely good at bringing people through thinking and talking in groups. So we are a very, very discursive education system. It's just normal for somebody from a New Zealand education system to come into somewhere and assume there's going to be some kind of group work or there's going to be some kind of discussion. It's a beautiful attribute. It's a beautiful attribute, but we don't look at it very much, and also as to why that's happened and why it's continued to happen. So even from the very earliest times, kids are sharing reading, sharing assignments, talking about stuff. You can trace it all the way through. And it hits when you leave this education system and you go into a very individualized system. And here's something amazing. I found this the other day. This is an NZEI poster from back in the 70s. And it's an interesting point because there was a time where this came from. This was before the rise of neoliberalism. In the 1940s, this is under Fraser and Beebe, through there into the 70s, we developed a child-centered kind of education. If you have a look at this is a poster that was advertising a film at the time. Have a look at this description if we go close up onto it. Read that. Now we would say that's revolutionary. That was us. That was us at the time that the world came to us to understand what great education was. That was us. And some of you were partly shaped by that education system. That's why I have immense hope. That's why I have immense hope. We've just got a difficulty that we have to collectively deal with. And that's why I see teachers fighting off things like performance pay. They're fighting them off because they have a memory of this. We know that this exists. This actually shaped generations of our country. So, what do? I think as I said, I'm not God, but this is what I have done all through my career, but it gathered momentum. I try to put a lot of work into self-evaluation with kids, so I ask them questions about how they learn. So very simple things like going, what's the best thing about this? And if you had another week, what would you change? And why? So you're actually causing them to self-evaluate. You're causing them to look into their learning process, to take control, to get in the tractor seat of their learning. Working with values. So this is John Dewey. So he says your fundamental... I like this guy, okay, but he says your fundamental need as a human being is not fame, it's not richness, it's actually to be valued. And if you understand that every human being, including the person who opposes you in some situation, is doing that because their fundamental need is to be valued, you can become hugely influential if you learn to work with people's need to be valued. Kids, we know what happens when they become valueless. We see what happens. And sometimes it's the groundsman or the office person or somebody else who's the only place that they get value. Sometimes there's no value at home. Sometimes there's huge value at home at a time when things are falling apart at school. But without that, by working consciously with it, I believe that you can lift things way beyond performance into something very deep. I come back to that person that you nominated right at the beginning of this thing. That was about value. You recognize it innately. I do everything I can to mitigate against the tyranny of the grade. So in schools, I will sit down with head teachers. This was even when I was a junior teacher. Go, is there a way of lessening the number of grades that we have to give out? What is absolutely needed here? If you say somebody else is requiring it, what is the absolute minimum they require? So we can work with description and discussion. What is the minimum? And really look strategically at it. So we are taking as much of that off the kids' experience as possible. I saw this last night, and although we were joking about it, it actually wasn't a joke. There is a spirit that exists inside people. And when last night you could feel it in the room, it was people were burned out, they're tired, you've had a hard term, and yet you were here exploding with hope and laughter, doing things together. The humanity of the learning is what drives great education. It just doesn't get nominated up into the limelight, but it is actually the thing. Some kids taught me this when I was teaching back in the day, something that was called Standard 1. At the end of the year, lots of them used to bring you a present. Some of them were pretty manky, but they were lovely. They were lovely. And you felt a little bit like a funeral hearse walking around the grounds because you were loaded up with flowers or whatever. But it was lovely, and I realised that's something that it taught me something. Like I found reports hugely damaging, and I was at a school where they were telling us that we had a little square for we had a grade, we had a ranking, and then we had a place to put tries harder or does well or whatever. And I knew these kids much better, and I wanted to tell their parents more. So I wrote on the back of the report. And I was taken aside and told I wasn't being a team player because I was putting pressure on all the other teachers. I didn't want to do that because I like these people. And so I said to the principal, well, I'd like to be able to send something home. And he said, no, you don't understand. You're not being a team player. And I said, well, one of the things that I really like about you is that this was almost a lie, but it was the closest I could get to it. One of the things I like about you is that you recognise that, we have to be able to communicate with parents really well. So what about if I don't write on the report, and I don't send this home with a report, but 2 days later, I just send a letter home to parents, just adding some stuff. And he said, well, so long as it doesn't put pressure on the other teachers. Well, I did, and here's the obvious thing that happened. When the parent interview came, the parents brought the letters in. They brought the letters in because they talked about their kids, about their acerbic wit, about the fact that the kid could see when someone was in trouble, they could recognise it before anybody else in the class. And they would talk to you about that. And sometimes there were parents who'd never been there before. They'd never been there. And one of my colleagues told me something very helpful about it. She said, it won't count for anything unless it counts for the principal. She said, tell the parents to tell the principal on the way out what a great job he's done. Shit, it worked. They walked up and said, oh, the wonderful, wonderful stuff. We love the letters. And he's going, oh, lovely, lovely. So the next day he wanted everyone to write letters, so that wasn't so. And I said, oh, well, maybe not. But, so today, knowing that with a thesis it's going to go out for a grade, that's going to be the last thing they get back. The last meeting I have with kids, you do this in 100 different ways, but I get a plant that year that they plant a herb normally that's a little bit like their character, like what I've experienced in their learning. Sometimes it's the legend of the plant, and I write them a letter. In a way, it's a love letter from a teacher to a learner, and then I give them the plant. And some of those plants drop dead on a windowsill. They don't even know how to water them. Yeah, well, someone has done this before. And some of them may be forgotten, but they never forget that. And if that stupid mark comes back having not understood their complexity, at least there's something else there. At least there's something else there. And what's there is very simply the nature of love. Thank you.